thank you very much. I'd like to thank Professor Kitsoyo for the invitation to speak here. It's a real honor also for the topic. Theosis or Theosis and icons is something which is obviously very interesting from a Byzantine perspective. I'll be speaking here as a Byzantinist, so working on the internal dynamics within Greek culture in the Middle Ages about these two concepts. In some ways they feel familiar, they're local concepts within the Byzantine sphere, while theosis or theosis is something that needs to be explained. In Greek it's obvious what it means, except in the details. So this is what I'll be focusing on, a sort of internal dynamic within Byzantine culture. I have a particular interest in, this is just to explain my strategy, which is in the Byzantine tradition, the Byzantines had a funny way of reading texts, which is that if a sentence was true, that was fine. They could cut it out and put it and use it elsewhere. Which means that if a pagan text said something which coincided with the Christian truth, there was no problem. And this is why you can mix pagan and Christian texts, and it works both ways. So that's what the topic I'll be dealing with today. There is no theosis without Constantinople. The term is rare in ancient Greek and was important after Constantinople became capital of the Roman Empire in 330 AD. It is derived from the word theos, the Greek word for God. More precisely, it comes from the word theor, to make divine, a causative verb. It indicates the process of making divine, so theosis means technically divinization. That would be a translation. In the 14th century, the Orthodox saint Gregory Palamas quoted Maximus the Confessor of the 7th century to explain what theosis meant. If we could have the next slide. Yeah, that's it. And what I read here is also going to be on the screen. Some texts are familiar, others a bit less. Also, the wise theologian Maximus says, quote, God has made us for this, in order that we share in the divine nature and participate in his eternity, unquote. The original quotation of Maximus the Confessor also includes a further definition of theosis. Yeah. For he has made us for this, in order that we share in the divine nature and we participate in his eternity. This you heard, and that we appear similar according to the divination originating in love. Maximus employs two concepts which derive from Plato. The first is the concept of methexis, so participation in the Latin tradition, and the second is the notion of homoiosis to theokatato dynaton, so the assimilation to the divine according to what is possible. The first concept was defined in Plato's Parmenides in different passages, 132d3, 140e4, 141d8, 51e8, 51b8, and 160a8. The reason why I mention the passages is to show that in Plato's Parmenides the concept appears often and it's relevant to what we're talking about. Aristotle, unfortunately, thought the concept meaningless. So we have a split in the Greek tradition at that point. The second concept of divinization as assimilation to the divine is first present in Plato's Theaetetus, 176a8, b2, where he defines philosophy as, and if we could have the next slide, there it is. No, back. There it is, yeah. Therefore, one must also try to flee as fast as possible from here to there. The flight is the assimilation to God as far as possible. Assimilation is to become just and holy with wisdom. Maximus the Confessor and Gregory Palamas used two Platonic concepts to define theosis. The concepts are two aspects of the same process. Theosis does not indicate a point of arrival, but a process. All terms in is or sis in Greek define a process. The result is usually in ma. That's an example. It does not lead to unio mystica, as it's sometimes known in Latin or Western theology. For the Orthodox, it is not possible to be unified in God or identified with God. Theosis is about approaching, striving towards the divine. Sometimes you have the term eros. Simon, the new theologian, has oi erotikoi ymnoi. That's obviously the Platonic concept of eros in the Symposium, striving towards the divine. Byzantine Platonists would also agree. If one turns to Proclus, the only Neoplatonist born in Constantinople, other than Julian the Apostate, and who was head of Plato's Academy for 50 years, he claims that the divine is completely unknowable and unreachable. This is Elements of Theology 1, 2, 3. For Christians, this is obvious given that St. Paul had referred to the unknown God in Athens, Acts 17:23. Plotinus disagreed and had argued that part of the soul is always divine in Enneads 4:8-8, and he says that he's going against Platonic doctrine, which is an interesting point of Plotinus. Something which Proclus said was wrong in Elements of Theology 2:11. So there's never a part of the soul which is permanently attached to the divine, according to Proclus, the Neoplatonist Proclus. So Byzantine Platonists and Orthodox Christians reject unio mystica in favor of theosis, an action towards the divine. Technically, Platonists prefer the term henosis, unification, since the divine principle is termed the one. But the same things apply. It's a process towards the one. But what is theosis? We have seen that Maximus the Confessor and Palamas believed it is participation in the divine and becoming like the divine. Proclus explains that God is the efficient cause as well as the final cause. God is the point of departure and arrival. Creation is the point of departure from God. Theosis is the manner of return towards God. It is the contemplation of the first cause. It is achieved by prayer. The Neoplatonist Proclus gives an extraordinary passage about prayer, and this is the next. There we get the face Proclus. Everything prays except God, says the great Theodore. Initiation begins from the most common goods and ends in the unification towards the divine and making the soul slowly used to the divine light. Now, if we removed the expression, says the great Theodore, this passage could easily be found in any Orthodox text. But it is a pagan one. Many of the terms here are very familiar from the Orthodox world. Orthodox Christians will recognize many of the terms in the passage from the definition of prayer within Christianity. Prayer is an activity which is undertaken by all creatures, whether animate or inanimate, according to Proclus. For Orthodox Christians, this is familiar from Psalm 148, for example. Even mountains can pray, where different elements of nature praise God. Prayer or divine unification or theosis is about establishing a link with the cause of one's existence. Theosis becomes an important and recurring concept from the 4th century AD onwards. I have already remarked the almost total absence of the term before then. The first Platonist who appears to deal with the question directly is Iamblichus. He's one of the most important authorities for Julian the Apostate and extremely influential for subsequent Platonists. As you remember, he had a dispute with Porphyry, so he marks the transition from one type of Neoplatonism to the next. He is famous for having written the main book about ancient Egyptian theology, the Egyptian Mysteries. Theosis is a term and possibly a concept mostly absent in ancient Greek before Iamblichus. However, the word may easily be translated into hieroglyphs. That's the next passage. And here it is. So, senecher means is the translation of theosis. It means to make divine. S is the causative in Egyptian. Necher is God. And we see an example here in the pyramid text. This is pyramid text 210, 127a. There is a passage where the pharaoh Unis or Unas 2345 BC and 2350 BC, fifth dynasty, is made divine by a group of gods, the dual Ennead Pesegeti. This is the sarcophagus chamber, east wall pyramid of Unis. The translation, the dual Ennead makes Unis divine. The reason why I picked the pyramid texts is that these become a backbone of Egyptian theology as it continues. In religions, very often there are marginal texts which may be very fashionable but can vanish. The pyramid texts influence the coffin text, and therefore it goes on till the last hieroglyphs, which are from the 5th century AD in Egypt, so well into the Byzantine era. This, of course, is the tradition of the ruler becoming a god, and is generally known as apotheosis or apotheosis in Greek, but the correct term in Greek seems to be ektheosis. That is the most usual term. However, the passage of the pyramid text allows one to focus on the question of ritual and prayer. Allen, the famous Egyptologist, translated the passage above as "the gods made me clean with natron." So he doesn't say theosis, making divine, but he interprets the word necher not as God, but as natron, so a form of sacred salt used for rituals in Egypt. The Greek term nitron, nitrates and all that, derives from the ancient Egyptian word for God, necher. There is a connection between material substance and divinization. It is connected to ritual and prayer, as Allen has shown in his translation. The term senecher also refers to incense in Egyptian. So to make divine in ancient Egypt is to use incense, something used to render something holy or divine. In ancient Egypt, making divine also refers to the rituals during prayer. Iamblichus, the Neoplatonist most interested in Egypt, indicates that the use of the materials such as incense was necessary for prayer. Again, this is in the Divine Mysteries. Thymiama, it is in Greek. The term he employs for this series of rituals is theurgia. Theurgy means operating on the divine or according to the divine. There's an ambiguity there in Greek. The Latin Saint Augustine famously attacked the notion of theurgy as pagan ritualistic superstition, and therefore condemned it in the Latin tradition. Maximus the Confessor, on the other hand, defines theurgy as something profoundly Christian. The term is employed in the Lateran Synod of 649, so that's one of the most important first councils ever held in Rome. In the 6th and 7th ecumenical councils, so the ones accepted by Catholics, Anglicans, Lutherans, and some other denominations, 681 and 787, so 681 energies and wills, 787 is the icons. The word theurgia is part of the decrees, so anyone who's a Christian has to accept it. Dionysius the Areopagite employs the term theurgia to refer to baptismal oil. He also defines divine illumination as theurgic. In Constantinople, the term theurgy indicates an action or activity connected to the divine, both for pagans and Christians. Next slide. Theosis means making divine. This term starts to appear in the 4th century. It defines the attempt of man to become like the divine, according to homoiosis, becoming similar, assimilation. It is achieved by purification and by prayer. Prayer is an activity which retraces the path of creation to the Creator. Prayer is directed towards the divine, as John Damascus indicates. And this is from the De Fide Orthodoxa. And here I read, as the inspired theologian Basil says, quote, "The worship to the icon goes beyond the prototype," unquote. The prototype is what depicted from which the product occurs. So here we have 4th century evidence of how to pray to an icon, endorsed by John of Damascus. In a period, obviously, John of Damascus is much more concerned with the iconoclastic background and problem. Prayer is directed towards the cause. Art concerning the divine according to Platonists, is acceptable only if it is divinely inspired. The term employed in Byzantine Greek, in Byzantine Greek texts, is occasionally ektipoma, a God-sent impression rather than a physical likeness. The formula of Theodore the Studite, again a very important person for the iconoclast question, is the following: for the assimilation through the impression of the archetype. So here we have exomoiosis, the term, ektipoma, and archetypos. The archetype, or prototype, provides the inspiration for the work of art, which is the means of assimilation to the divine. It is not the impression which is revered, but the activity which causes that impression. Next slide. The Neoplatonist Damascus in the 6th century gives the name Theosis to such divine activity. The Little Scott Jones, Greek-English dictionary, in what I believe is a moment of pure panic when he has to define what the word Theosis is, actually uses a Byzantine Greek text, which is not a great sign. And he uses the passage you see here. Defines Theosis based on the 6th century text. The LSJ thus confirms the Byzantine nature of the term. The passage employed is the following: why must one say many, when nearly all the philosophers before Iamblichus posit many gods, and they claim that there is one God above being, and the others are beings rendered divine by illuminations which come from the one? They say that the multitude of henads above being are not substances complete in themselves, but enlightened by a single God, and which enable divinizations for beings. Obviously, many of these, a large part of this passage is not acceptable for Christians, but it's interesting that the pagan Damascus is making a point that there is one God. So he believes in a multitude of gods, but only one which is above being. So that's an interesting explanation of a pagan monotheism. The notion is modelled on the original text by Proclus, which does not use the term theosis, but henosis, the standard Neoplatonic term for the same principle. Here is the text from Elements of Theology 63. From this it is apparent that the states of unity with which one irradiates existence are participated, some enduringly, others for a time. And this is a translation from Dodds. But interesting, and I've underlined it there, is the term henosis in exactly the same place as theosis. So it's a paraphrase, but it's the same concept, which shows that there is an overlap between the two. Therefore, theosis has two meanings. One, approaching the divine, like the homoiosis to theokatato dynaton, assimilation to the divine according to what is possible. And then two, making divine. The second example is the one clearly present in the pyramid of Unis. The gods made Unis divine. The two meanings account for the individual approaching the divine, as well as persons or objects which participate in divine illuminations or activities/energies. An example of the latter is the icon for Orthodox believers, as well as items such as incense for Christians and pagans alike. These become instruments of theosis of the individual. The activity of making divine constitutes the inspiration which gives an icon its impression. In Platonic thought, it allows Proclus to reclaim art, which is theological and divinely inspired. So that's really the key element. Obviously, that is a reading of Plato's Republic, which is in some ways legitimate. Plato is against mimetic art of imitation, but he does say that divinely inspired art or music, for example, is absolutely acceptable. These concepts add obstacles for some aspects of interreligious dialogue. Better not to neglect them, but to face them directly. We have seen how participation, methexis, is considered meaningless by Aristotle. This is a problem for the tradition of Aristotelian thought, such as Latin scholasticism and Arabic thought. Moreover, theosis, an approach towards God, is opposed to the unification with God, the unia mystica. This means that theosis is different to what Meister Eckhart had argued in the Latin tradition of Rhineland mysticism, for example. The fact that theurgy is considered a Christian concept, which refers to prayer and ritual in the Lateran Council of 649 and two ecumenical councils of 681 and 787, makes the condemnation by St. Augustine problematic. Nevertheless, the differences in tradition allow one to focus on the specific qualities and characteristics of the matter at hand. Theosis is a Byzantine concept which defines the approach towards the divine. The way this is achieved is prayer, which has theological aspect. John of Damascus says that prayer towards an icon is given towards what is depicted rather than the depiction itself. Divine inspiration leads to art which is theologically correct. And we get another slide. The first passage from Proclus in the Republic, the inspired one turns the soul's words towards the divine. And here I'm using the word enthusiastikos, remembering that enthusiasmos comes from the Greek term entheos, so inspired by God or with something divine. Or how will it be closer to the one if we do not uplift the one of the soul, which is in us, as an image of the one, insofar as the more accurate texts say that there is inspiration. And here's very interesting, the idea of God having an image within one's heart or one's inside is also a Christian concept. It's actually present in the New Testament, if I'm not mistaken. Divine inspiration is important for seizing the image of the divine. Proclus indicates that philosophers are inspired like poets or artists. Many do not notice that a philosopher is also divinely inspired. This is a funny incidental remark. Proclus is trying to say, we're artists too, somehow. One may be made dizzy by hearing and reading Platonic doctrines present in Proclus. The Orthodox Saint Palamas summarizes these concepts and presents them as Christian in the following passage. And that's the next text. The great Basil has said that the heart leaps and bounds by the inspiration of the love of the good. Saint Athanasius gives us this sign of charity to go out from prayer as if on fire when someone will make a prayer to God with a pure mind. It is by experience, as St. John Climacus teaches us clearly. And this is in the treatise in favor of the hesychasts, so defending a purely orthodox doctrine, but he's using terms such as inspiration, divine inspiration, irrational inspiration, which has echoes from Neoplatonism. Divine inspiration is an integral part of theosis as well as henosis. When the artist is divinely inspired, the image itself makes theosis easier. What makes an image holy is not the human creation, but the divine inspiration. We have indicated that this is also theosis. The Synod of Constantinople, held in 1094, the Synod of Blacherne, is clear. Anathema to who says holy icons participate in divine charity or divine love, but are not of the same nature as the prototypes. This argument develops what John of Damascus had already said on icons. He also describes the transfiguration of Christ in such terms, and this is slide 10, and we're approaching the end. There we are. This is John of Damascus, describing the transfiguration itself, which is extraordinary. For he remains in the superiority of his own divinity and participates in the inferior. He makes divine the human nature on his own and confuses the archetype with the image and displays his own beauty in it today. So this is a speech on the Feast of the Transfiguration, but we see the term methexis, we see the term archetype. So John of Damascus, in a very Byzantine way, is mixing the ontological question with the artistic one in this passage, saying that Christ is a living example of the two together. Christ is both God and icon, according to John of Damascus. The two natures use participation, methexis, in relation to the other. For later Neoplatonists, as well as Orthodox Christians, an image is an instrument to contemplate what can be seized of the divine. For both the term is divine light, theon phos, emanating directly from God, or the One, such as the disciples saw during the transfiguration of Mount Tabor. Once one has achieved this, one may sit back and appreciate this extraordinary Byzantine text. And this is the conclusion. Here, the next slide, the last one. This is Proclus speaking. If we even now shed away our complicated ideas and remove all variety of life from us, once we are in total peace, we may come closer to the cause of all. May we not only have peace of mind and imagination and rest from the passions which block the path towards the first elevation, but may the air also be peaceful, and may everything be restful. May everything constantly lead us upward towards the participation in the unspoken or the ineffable. This text could easily be put in an Orthodox context, but it's purely pagan. God is the cause. He sheds the divine-made light which individuals contemplate. This divine light is present also in Proclus and is known as the theon phos. The Byzantine concepts of theosis and icon both depend on the Platonic notion of methexis. Thank you very much.